Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are journeying into the velvet-lined halls of the past, stepping softly into the drafty corridors of Europe's great palaces. Tonight, we explore the heavy, shimmering, and often fractured world of red flag royalty. As always, take a moment to settle. Let the weight of your day settle into the mattress beneath you. Adjust your pillows. Let your breathing find its own natural, easy pace. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight, perhaps from a quiet city or a house tucked away near the woods. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. In the beginning of the great dynasties, there was order. There was the crown, the scepter, and the stone. We are taught to look at history as a solid thing-a-line of kings and queens, carved from marble, unmoving and resolute. But if you look closer, past the gold leaf and the heavy oil paintings, you find that power is not a solid thing at all. It is a vapor. It is a flickering candle in a very large, very dark room. For centuries, the bloodlines of Europe moved like slow, deep rivers. To be a monarch was to be more than a person. It was to be a vessel for the divine. They were told from birth that their blood was different, thicker, perhaps, or tinged with the blue of the heavens. But blood, no matter how noble, carries secrets. It carries the history of those who came before, the echoes of ancient triumphs, and the quiet, persistent seeds of instability. Tonight, we speak of the red flags, not the banners of war that flew over battlefields, but the warning signs that flickered in the eyes of the mighty. We speak of the moments when the mind, burdened by the impossible weight of a crown, began to drift away from the shore of reality. Imagine, if you will, the silence of a palace at midnight. The way the candlelight stretches the shadows of the tapestries until the figures woven into the silk seem to breathe. For some monarchs, these shadows became more real than their advisors. For some, the crown was not a symbol of authority, but a cage of cold gold that pressed against the temples until the world began to blur. We will travel tonight through the frost-covered plains of Russia, where the czars looked out over an endless white horizon and saw ghosts. We will walk the sun-drenched halls of Spain, where a queen's grief became so vast, so heavy, that she refused to let the world move on. We will sit in the quiet gardens of England and France, listening to the whispers of kings who spoke to the moon or believed their bodies were made of fragile, shimmering glass. These were not merely mad rulers. That word is too sharp, too modern. They were people lost in the fog of their own power. They were souls fated to wear the sun upon their heads while living in a perpetual winter of the mind. As we move through these stories, notice how the themes repeat much like the cycles of the earth: the isolation of the throne, the pressure of the bloodline, the way the world looks when you are told, from your first breath, that you are the only person who truly matters. So, let the history wash over you like a slow-moving tide. Do not worry about the dates or the names of the treaties. Those are for the waking world. Tonight, we are interested only in the atmosphere of the past. The creak of a floorboard in the Tower of London. The rustle of a silk gown in the Hofburg. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of a clock in a room where a king sits alone, waiting for a dawn that feels 1,000 years away. The crown is heavy, but your head is light. The scepter is cold, but your bed is warm. Let us step back now into the first of our tales. Into an age where the line between a god and a ghost was very thin indeed. Take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, Imagine the air growing cooler, turning into the crisp, dampened mist of 14th century France. We are leaving the abstract chaos of the cosmos and entering the stone-walled reality of the Valois dynasty. But here, reality is just as thin as a veil. Here we meet a man who was once called Charles the Beloved, a title that felt like a warm sun on the shoulders of his kingdom. Before the shadows grew long and the title shifted to something far more haunting. Charles the Mad. Imagine the year 1392. The sun is high over the forest of Le Mans. The king is riding at the head of his army. The rhythmic clop-clop of horse hooves against the dry earth, acting as a metronome for the afternoon. Clop, clop, clop. It is a steady sound, a grounding sound. The king is young, handsome, and strong. He wears the heavy armor of his station, the steel plates reflecting the golden light of the French countryside. But beneath the steel, something is beginning to fray. For weeks, the king had been unwell. A fever had taken root in his blood, a slow-burning heat that made the edges of his vision curl like scorched parchment. His advisors whispered in the corridors of the palace, their voices like the dry rustle of autumn leaves. They said the king was tired. They said the crown was pressing too hard against his brow. But the king insisted on riding. He insisted on being the sun around which his court orbited. As they rode through the deep green silence of the forest, a strange figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. A man, dressed in rags the color of grave dust, sprang toward the king's horse. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for the king's mind. "O king, ride no further." The man cried, his voice cracking like a dry branch. "Turn back, you are betrayed." The man was chased away, lost back into the tangled thicket of the woods, but the words remained. They hung in the still, hot air. Betrayed, betrayed, betrayed. The king did not speak. He continued to ride, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, but the rhythmic sound of the horses changed. It was no longer a comforting beat. It was a drum, a war drum, a heartbeat. Then a small sound, the clatter of a page's spear falling against a steel helmet, shattered the silence. To the king's ears, it was not a small accident. It was the crack of a cannon. It was the signal for the end of the world. In an instant, the beloved king vanished, and in his place was a whirlwind of steel and terror. He drew his sword, his eyes wide and unseeing, and began to strike out at his own knights, his own blood, seeing only ghosts and traitors where there were only friends. When the exhaustion finally took him, and the king fell into a deep, heavy slumber, the world he woke up to was different. The fever had broken, but the mirror of his mind had cracked. As the years began to stretch out like long shadows across a courtyard, a new and strange red flag began to emerge. The King of France, the most powerful man in the land, began to believe a terrible secret about his own body. He believed that he was not made of flesh and bone. He believed he was made of glass. Think for a moment about the nature of glass. It is beautiful. It is clear. It is pure. But it is also dangerously, terrifyingly fragile. Charles VI began to live his life in a state of perpetual, silent caution. He feared that if he moved too quickly, he would shatter into 10,000 glittering shards upon the floor of the Louvre. He feared the touch of his wife. He feared the embrace of his children. To him, a hug was not an act of love. It was a threat of annihilation. He began to wear reinforced clothing, thick ribs of iron sewn into his silk doublets, not to protect him from assassins, but to hold his glass torso together. Can you imagine the loneliness of a glass king? To sit on a throne of stone and velvet, surrounded by the bustling noise of a kingdom, and to feel as though you are a delicate ornament placed on the edge of a shelf. Every footstep in the hallway was a vibration that threatened his existence. Every loud voice was a shockwave. He would sit for hours, perfectly still, his breath shallow and rhythmic, watching the light catch the windows and wondering if he was any different from the panes of colored glass in the cathedral. This is the first great red flag of royalty, the isolation of the unique. When you are told you are a god or a chosen being, the mind begins to seek reasons for its own suffering. If Charles felt brittle, if he felt broken by the politics and the wars of his age, his mind gave that feeling a physical form. Glass. There were months of clarity, where the king would return to himself, a gentle man, lost in a violent time. But the glass would always return. He began to forget his own name. He began to forget that he was a king at all. He would run through the corridors of the palace, howling like a wolf, fleeing from enemies that only he could see. He refused to bathe for months at a time, his body becoming a map of neglect. For how can one wash a body that might break under the pressure of water? The court moved around him like ghosts. They continued to bow. They continued to bring him documents to sign. They treated the glass man as if he were still the son of France. But the light was fading. The power was shifting to his uncles, to his brothers, to the wolves who waited for the glass to finally break. As you listen to the story of Charles, let your own body feel heavy. Unlike the king, you are not made of glass. You are safe. You are grounded. You are supported by your bed, a solid and certain thing. You do not have to worry about shattering. You can let go of the tension in your shoulders. You can let the iron ribs of your own worries fall away. History is a long, slow walk through a gallery of broken things. Charles VI was but the first to show us that the crown does not just sit upon the head, it sinks into the mind. It is a weight that some are born to carry, and some are born to be crushed by. The King of Glass spent 30 years drifting in and out of the shadows. He saw his kingdom torn apart by the English. He saw his family turn against one another. And through it all, he remained in his silent, transparent prison. He simply went dark, like a lamp being extinguished at the end of a very long night. And as the bells of Paris tolled for the Glass King, another story was already beginning to unfold in the South, a story of a queen whose heart was not made of glass, but of a leaden, unyielding grief that would stop time itself. We leave the cool, brittle air of the French court and travel south, crossing the rugged, snow-capped peaks of the Pyrenees. As we descend into the heart of the Iberian Peninsula, the air changes. It becomes dry, smelling of dust, wild rosemary, and ancient, unyielding sun. We are entering a land of deep shadows and sharp light, the Spain of the 16th century. And here we find a story not of glass, but of a heart that refused to stop breaking. Imagine a woman standing on the edge of a high stone balcony. This is Joanna, the daughter of the most powerful monarchs the world has ever known, Isabella and Ferdinand. She was born into a world of absolute certainty, of ironclad faith and golden expansion. But as you breathe in the stillness of the night, realize that Joanna's life was not a series of triumphs. It was a slow, rhythmic descent into a grief so profound that the world eventually had to lock her away just to keep her quiet. Joanna was never meant to be the focus of the world's gaze. She was a middle child, a spare thread in the royal tapestry. But as the years turned, Death the Great, silent visitor, took her siblings one by one, until the heavy weight of the Spanish crown sat precariously upon her head. But Joanna did not care for crowns. Her world was centered on a single man, Philip. History calls him Philip the Handsome, a man of golden hair and a smile like a summer morning, but a man whose heart was as restless as the wind. When Philip passed away suddenly in the heat of a Spanish summer, something within Joanna did not just break, it solidified. It became a monument. For the listener at home, tucked beneath the safety of their sheets, imagine the silence of a room when a clock stops ticking. That was Joanna's world. To her, time was no longer a river flowing toward the sea. It was a stagnant pool, reflecting only the face of the man she had lost. She refused to believe that the story had ended, and so began one of the most haunting processions in the history of the human spirit. Imagine the Spanish countryside at midnight. The moon is a thin silver sliver in a sky as black as obsidian. The only sound is the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on the dusty road and the creak of wooden wheels. In the center of this procession is a coffin draped in heavy velvet, and following closely behind, her eyes wide and unblinking, is the Queen. For months, Joanna traveled only by night. She believed that a widow should not be seen by the sun, that the light of day was too harsh, too joyful for a heart as heavy as hers. She led her court, her guards, and her mourning priests across the desolate plains of Castile, moving the body of her husband from monastery to monastery. Each time the procession stopped, she would order the casket to be opened. She would touch the cold wood. She would speak into the silence, and she would wait for a reply that never came. Can you feel the weight of that walk? The way the cold night air bites at the skin, the way the torches flicker and hiss in the wind. This is the second red flag of royalty, the refusal to let go of what is gone. When you are a queen, the world is supposed to obey you. The tides are supposed to turn at your command. But death does not listen to crowns. And for Joanna, the realization that she could not command her husband back to life manifested as a beautiful, terrifying obsession. The people began to whisper. They called her Juana Loca Joanna, the mad. But was it madness? Or was it a devotion so pure that the rest of the world looked shallow in comparison? She was a woman trapped between two worlds, the world of the living, which demanded she rule, and the world of the dead, where her heart resided. Her father, and later her son, watched this from the shadows. They saw a woman who was no longer fit to manage the complex gears of an empire. They saw her as a problem to be solved, a flame to be smothered. They eventually took her to the fortress of Tordesillas. Imagine a room with high, narrow windows that look out onto a world she was no longer allowed to touch. She stayed in that fortress for nearly 50 years. 50 years of watching the dust motes dance in the light. 50 years of listening to the wind howl around the stone turrets. She lived in a perpetual twilight, rarely changing her clothes, rarely speaking to anyone who wasn't a ghost. Outside those walls, empires rose and fell. Gold flowed from the New World. Great cathedrals were built. But inside, Joanna remained in the same moment she had entered in 1506, the moment the world went quiet. As you lie there, feel the stillness of your own room. Unlike Joanna, your stillness is a gift. It is a space for rest, not a prison of memory. You are free to let the day go. You do not have to carry the weight of a lost empire or a cold casket. You can simply be. Joanna's story reminds us that the mind can be a vast, echoing hall. If we fill it only with one thing, one grief, one fear, one desire, we lose the ability to see the doors. She chose to stay in the hallway of her sorrow, and the world, in its cruelty, locked the door from the outside. As the years blurred into decades, Joanna became a legenda, shadow queen, who still held the title, but none of the power. She was the red flag of the Habsburgs, a warning that the blood of kings is often heavy with the lead of melancholy. And as the sun sets over the towers of Tordesillas, we turn our gaze north, across the cold, choppy waters of the English Channel. We move from the queen who could not forget, to a king who could not stop talking, a king who found his own solace in the rustle of the leaves and the company of the trees. He loved the stars. He loved the precision of a clock's gears. He loved the way a seed, when planted correctly, would always grow true to its nature. But as the years pressed on, the order of his mind began to slip, like a gear losing its teeth. The red flag of George III was not one of violence or cruelty, but of an overwhelming torrential flow of thought. Imagine a river that has burst its banks. The words would spill out of him fast, rhythmic, and unceasing. He would talk for hours, his voice a steady drone like the hum of a beehive, moving from the price of grain to the movement of the planets without ever taking a breath. To listen to him was to be caught in a tide of language, a sea of information that had no shore. One evening, as the shadows of the oaks grew long and blue across the grass, it is said the king stopped before a great, gnarled tree. To the eyes of his worried attendants, it was just a treean, unmoving monument of wood and leaf. But to George, in the shimmering heat of his fevered mind, the tree was something else. He saw not bark, but the fine robes of a diplomat. He saw not branches, but the welcoming arms of a friend. He reached out his hand, his fingers tracing the rough, cool texture of the oak, and he began to speak. He spoke to the tree as if it were the king of Prussia. He spoke of treaties and alliances, of the balance of power and the weight of the world. And as he spoke, the wind rustled through the leaves above him, a soft, sibilant she and to the king. This was the tree's reply. This was the counsel of the forest. Consider for a moment the peace that might be found in such a state. To the outside world, this was a tragedy, a king losing his grip on the solid reality of his office. But for George, perhaps the trees were easier to talk to than the men in his court. Trees do not argue. Trees do not demand taxes or rebel against the crown. They simply stand, they endure, they breathe with the rhythm of the seasons. As you lie there now, imagine yourself as one of those ancient oaks, Feel your limbs growing heavy and still. Your roots are deep, deep in the cool, dark earth, far below the noise of the surface. The wind of the world may blow through your leaves, bringing whispers of worries or tasks left undone, but you do not have to move. You are grounded, you are ancient, you are part of a silence that is much older than the words of kings. George's mind was a restless thing, a red flag of pure exhaustion. His body was often in pain, his skin sensitive to the touch of his royal robes, which felt to him like thorns. He sought refuge in the quiet things. He loved the ticking of his many clocks. He would sit in a room filled with them, listening to the polyphonic rhythm tick-tock tick, tock, hundreds of tiny metallic hearts beating in unison. In that mechanical order, he found a sanctuary from the chaos of his own thoughts. The world remembers George III for the loss of the American colonies, for the political strife that defined his reign. But the history of the Mad King is really a history of a man trying to find a quiet place to sit down. He was a man who, when the crown became too heavy, looked to the stars through his telescopes and saw a universe that did uncare about the squabbles of men. He saw the moons of Jupiter and the rings of Saturn moving in a slow, eternal dance that no king could ever interrupt. Eventually, the king retreated entirely into the silence of Windsor Castle. He grew a long white beard that made him look like a figure from a forgotten myth, a druid or a wizard of the old woods. He lived in a world of music and memory, playing the harpsichord in the dim light, the notes drifting through the empty hallways like the ghosts of his youth. He could no longer see the sun, and he could no longer hear the voices of his children, but he still had the trees. He still had the rhythmic ticking of the clocks. Let the image of the king at his harpsichord stay with you. The room is dark, lit only by a single, flickering candle. The music is slow, a melody by Handel, rising and falling like a gentle breath. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The notes are like drops of water falling into a still pond. There is a profound lesson in the red flags of George III. It is the lesson of the need for retreat. When the world demands too much, the mind will find a way to go where it is safe, whether that is into a garden, into a song, or into the heart of an oak tree. As we leave the king in his quiet chamber, the music fades into the sound of the wind. We move away from the misty gardens of England and turn our eyes toward the east, toward the jagged mountains and fairy tale forests of Bavaria. We move toward a king who did not just talk to the trees, but who tried to turn the world itself into a stage, a dream made of stone and swan feathers. We leave the ticking clocks of Windsor and the damp English mist behind. We travel east and south, crossing the great heart of Europe, where the land begins to ripple and rise. The air grows sharper now, thinner and colder, carrying the scent of pine needles, crushed ice, and wood smoke. We are entering the Bavarian Alps, a landscape of jagged granite peaks and lakes so blue they look like fallen pieces of the sky. Ludwig was a creature of the moon. He hated the sun. He found the daylight too revealing, too harsh, too demanding. He would dress in elaborate robes of fur and gold, and he would order his servants to prepare his great, ornate sleigh. Close your eyes and listen to the sound of that journey. Swish, 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 the blades of the sleigh cutting through the fresh, powdery snow of the Bavarian forest. Think of Neuschwanstein, castle of white limestone and soaring towers, perched precariously on a cliffside. It was not built for defense. It was built for a dream. It was a stage set where the king could play the part of a legendary knight, far away from the prying eyes of his ministers. Inside these castles, the king's mind wandered through even stranger corridors. He built a grotto on artificial cavelet by the first electric lights in Bavaria, where he would be rowed across an underground lake in a boat shaped like a giant golden swan. The water would lap gently against the sides of the boat lap. Lap, lap. The king would listen to the echoes of singers hidden in the rocks, performing the tragic stories of Lohengrin and Tannhauser. Consider the weight of such a fantasy. To build a world where you are never corrected, where every wall is a painting of a legend, and where the only sound is the music you love. It is a beautiful prison. For Ludwig, the red flag was his withdrawal. He began to fear the touch of other people. He would hold banquets for ghost guests, setting the table for the long-dead kings of France. Louis XIV and Louis XV, speaking to the empty chairs, as if his royal ancestors were sitting right beside him. His ministers, worried by the mounting debts and the king's refusal to speak to them, began to whisper the word madness behind closed doors. They did not understand that Ludwig wasn't losing his mind. He was simply moving it to a different location. He was relocating his soul to the highest towers of his castles, where the air was too thin for politics to survive. They eventually came for him. They trapped him in his own fantasy, declaring him unfit to rule. But even then, the king remained a mystery. He died in the shallow, dark waters of Lake Starnberg, a mystery that the mountains have never whispered the answer to. Was it an accident? Was it a choice? Or did the king simply decide that the dream had finally come to an end? The red flags of the past are like the stars. They are bright and distant, and they do not demand anything from you tonight. You do not have to build castles. You do not have to ride through the snow. We leave the shimmering, swan-filled lakes of Bavaria and travel further east than we have ever gone before. The air changes again. The crisp alpine chill is replaced by a cold that feels ancient. A cold that does not just touch the skin, but sinks into the very marrow of the bone. We are crossing the vast, endless steppes of Russia, where the horizon stretches out until the earth and the sky become one gray, unblinking eye. We are entering Moscow, a city of red brick, golden domes, and secrets that have been frozen for centuries. Here, we meet the man history calls Ivan the Terrible, but perhaps a better word for our journey tonight is Ivan the Haunted. Imagine the Kremlin not as a tourist destination, but as a labyrinth, a maze of narrow, winding corridors, where the walls are thick enough to swallow a scream, and the windows are small, squinting things that let in only the palest sliver of light. Ivan was a man born into a storm. He was a child king, a boy who watched from the shadows as the powerful nobles, the boyars, fought over his kingdom like wolves over a carcass. This is where the red flags began to take root, not in a void, but in the fertile, dark soil of fear. As you settle into your rest, imagine the rhythm of a Russian winter. Crunch, 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 the sound of heavy boots on packed snow. The way the wind howls around the corners of the stone cathedrals, a long, low moan that sounds like a choir of ghosts. Ivan lived in this rhythm. He was a man of intense, burning intellect, but his mind was like a fortress that had been under siege for too long. He began to see the world not as a place of beauty, but as a series of traps. The red flag of Ivan was paranoia. Paranoia so thick it was like a fog that never lifted. He believed that everyone was a traitor. Every smile was a mask. Every bow was a hidden insult. Every gift was a vessel for poison. Think of the exhaustion of such a life, to never truly close your eyes, to never let your shoulders drop, to always be listening for the sound of a dagger being drawn or a whisper in the dark. In his search for safety, Ivan did something that no other king had ever dreamed of. He split his world in two. He created the tree, his own private world within a world. He dressed his men in black, like monks of death, and they rode black horses with the heads of dogs attached to their saddles. They were the shadows made flesh. But let us look past the violence of the history books and look instead at the atmosphere of the man. Ivan spent hours, days, weeks in the dim light of the great cathedrals. Imagine the smell of the air, they're thick with the scent of beeswax, old incense, and the damp cold of stone that has never felt the sun. The flickering of 1,000 candles against the golden beacons, flicker, flicker, flicker. The king would prostrate himself on the floor, his forehead touching the cold marble, seeking a peace that his own mind refused to give him. He was a man of double-down devotion. He would pray until his knees bled, and then he would rise and sign death warrants with a hand that did not shake. This is the ultimate red flag of the fractured crown, the inability to find the center. Ivan was a man of extremes: extreme love, extreme rage, extreme faith, and extreme cruelty. As you lie there, feel the contrast in your own space. Unlike the Tsar, you do not need to build walls of stone to be safe. Your safety is here, in the quiet, in the softness of your pillow, in the steady, effortless rise and fall of your chest. You do not have to watch the door. You do not have to listen for the wolves. The wolves of the past are only stories now, and stories cannot hurt you. They are only waves of sound washing over you, pulling you deeper into the dark, cool water of sleep. One of the most haunting images of Ivan is not of him as a conqueror, but of him as an old man, wandering the halls of the Kremlin at night. He suffered from terrible insomnia, the same restlessness that perhaps you have felt on other nights. He would walk the corridors with a candle in his hand, the light casting a long, wavering shadow that looked like a giant stalking him from behind. He was a king of an empire, but he was a prisoner of the night. He would talk to himself, his voice a low, rhythmic mutter, reciting the names of those he had lost and those he had destroyed. It was a litany of grief, a rhythmic counting of sorrows. 1 name, 2 names, 10 names, 100. The counting of names is like the counting of sheep, but for Ivan, they brought no sleep. They only brought more ghosts. This is the tragedy of the red flag royalty. The higher the throne, the more isolated the seat. Ivan the Terrible was a man who became a mountain vast, cold, and lonely. He pushed everyone away until there was nothing left but the snow and the silence. And in that silence, his mind began to unravel like a piece of old silk, the threads coming apart one by one until there was no longer a king, only a shadow. As we leave the Kremlin, we hear the great bells of Moscow beginning to toll. Bong, 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 a heavy, bronze sound that vibrates in the earth. It is a sound that marks the end of an era and the beginning of a long, cold sleep for the Russian soul. We turn our backs on the snow and the iron, and we begin the long journey back toward the west, toward the sun-drenched but fading glory of a different kind of decline. We move now toward a land where the blood has grown too thin and the mind has grown too tired. We move toward the end of a line, to a place where the red flags are written in the very shape of a man's face. We turn our gaze away from the heavy, iron-scented air of Moscow and travel back toward the west, toward the salt-sprayed coasts of the North Sea. The air becomes lighter here, tinged with the scent of cold ocean water, wet sand, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco and old parchment. We are entering Copenhagen in the middle of the 18th century. It is a city of elegant spires, cobblestone streets, and a palace that sits like a massive, silent ship on the edge of the water. Here we find a king who was not a tyrant or a dreamer, but a ghost in his own life. This is the story of Christian VII, the Puppet King. Imagine a boy born into a room filled with giant shadows. Christian was a small, delicate child, with eyes that seemed to see things others could not, shadows in the corners of the room. The way the light played across the gilded mirrors of the Christiansborg Palace. From his earliest days, he was told that he was a king, a sovereign, a divine ruler. But he was also told that he was nothing. His tutors were hard men who believed that a king must be forged like steel through coldness and discipline. They did not understand that Christian was not steel. He was more like a violin string wound, too tight, vibrating with a frequency that the world was not ready to hear. As you lie there, listen to the sound of the Danish coast, swoosh, pull, swoosh, pull, the tide coming in and out against the stone harbor walls. It is a slow, ancient breath. Christian lived in a world that felt just as rhythmic, but far less natural. His life was a series of ceremonies, a long parade of bows and titles and empty words. To the outside world, he was the king of Denmark and Norway. To himself, he was an actor on a stage where the play never ended and the audience never left. The red flag of Christian VII was a peculiar kind of detachment. It was as if his soul had stepped back from the front of his eyes and retreated deep into the back of his mind. He began to treat his kingdom like a game. He would run through the streets of Copenhagen at night, breaking windows and brawling with the common people, not out of malice, but because he wanted to feel something, anything that wasn't a royal protocol. He wanted to feel the sting of the wind, the grit of the cobblestones, the reality of a world that didn't bow to him. Inside the palace, his behavior grew even more surreal. He would arrange the furniture in his rooms to resemble a battlefield and then stage imaginary wars with his boots. He would leap over the backs of his ministers during serious council meetings, laughing a high, thin laugh that echoed off the marble walls. He began to believe that he was a changeling, a child of the fairies who had been left in the palace by mistake. Consider the stillness of the palace at night. Imagine the long, polished hallways where the floor is so shiny it looks like black water. Christian would walk these halls alone, his footsteps making a soft, rhythmic click, 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 click against the stone. He would talk to the statues. He would whisper secrets to the portraits of his ancestors, believing that their painted eyes were watching his every move. This is the seventh red flag, the loss of the self within the office. When the crown is too big, it slips down and covers the eyes. Christian was a man who had been hollowed out by his own status. He allowed others to rule for him, his physician, his stepmother, his ministers, while he retreated into a world of books, gymnastics, and quiet, internal conversations. He was a puppet who knew his strings were being pulled, and in his own strange way, he found a certain peace in letting go of the controls. As you listen to the story of the Puppet King, feel your own strings becoming loose. You do not have to perform tonight. You do not have to be the person the world expects you to be. You do not have to answer to anyone. Like Christian, in his quiet moments, you can simply retreat into the softness of your own mind. The world outside, the taxes, the schedules, the expectations is just a play being performed in another room. You can close the door. You can let the actors finish their lines without you. Christian VII lived for many years in this half-light. He was a king who was rarely seen but always present, a signature on a document, a name whispered in the halls. He found comfort in the predictable. He loved the way the sun would hit the same spot on the rug every afternoon at 3 o'clock. He loved the way the salt air made the wood of the palace doors swell so they were harder to open, keeping the world at bay. He was a man of the Enlightenment who had lost his own light, but in the darkness he found a different kind of vision. He saw the absurdity of power. He saw that the gold was just metal and the titles were just breath. He lived in the gaps between the words. And so, as we leave the quiet, misty shores of Denmark, we hear the sound of the wind rattling the window panes of the palace. It is a lonely sound, but it is also a soothing one. It tells us that the day is over. It tells us that even the most fractured mind can find a place to rest if it stops trying to fight the tide. We move now from the north to the south, back toward the center of the old world. We move toward the golden city of Prague, where an emperor is sitting in a room filled with stars, clocks, and the shimmering dust of alchemy. We move toward a ruler who didn't want to rule the earth, but the very secrets of life itself. Imagine a man sitting in a room that feels less like a palace and more like a dream. Rudolf was a collector. He was a seeker. He was a man who looked at the maps of his empire, the vast stretches of Germany, Austria, and Hungary, and felt nothing but a heavy, cold exhaustion. Rudolf did not want to talk to ambassadors. He wanted to talk to the universe. He filled his castle with the greatest minds of his age, astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Keplerman, who spent their nights staring at the velvet blackness of the sky, tracking the slow, silent dance of the planets. The walls are lined with shelves that hold the world in miniature. There are narwhal tusks that the emperor believed were the horns of unicorns. There are dried mandrake roots, shimmering crystals from the depths of the earth, and ancient Egyptian amulets that smell of spice and thyme. He was a man of melancholy, a word the doctors of his time used to describe a mind that had turned inward. You are surrounded by the things that make you feel safe. He believed that if he could just find the right combination of elements, he could turn lead into gold. But perhaps, in the quiet of his heart, he was looking for a different kind of alchemy. Perhaps he was trying to turn the lead of his royal responsibilities into the gold of a quiet mind. He watched the bubbling of his glass vials glug, 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 and saw in the shifting colors a reflection of his own soul. His red flag was a refusal to participate in the reality of the 1600s. While Europe was teetering on the edge of the 30 Years' War, Rudolf was studying the Voynich manuscript, a book written in a language no one could read, filled with drawings of plants that did not exist. He lived in a world of symbols and ciphers. He believed that if he could just understand the music of the spheres, he would never have to hear the sound of a drum of war. As the years blurred together, Rudolf became a myth to his own people. They knew he was there, in the castle on the hill, because they could see the light from his laboratory windows late into the night. They called him the Wizard Emperor. As you listen to the story of the Alchemist King, feel your own mind becoming a quiet laboratory. The worries of the morning are just lead. You are letting them go. You are transforming them into the stillness of the night. The story of Rudolf II ends not with a bang, but with a slow fading of the light. He was eventually deposed by his brother, a man of action and iron. Left, right, left, right. As we leave the golden city of Prague, we hear the gears of the great astronomical clock in the town square beginning to turn. It is a heavy, mechanical sound, the sound of time being measured out in small, careful increments. It is a sound that tells us that everything is in its place. Everything is moving exactly as it should. We move now from the mystical towers of Bohemia, traveling west again, toward a land of rigid etiquette and grand palaces. We move toward a man who was an emperor but wanted only to be a simple man, whose red flag was a heart that was too gentle for the iron world of the 19th century. We leave the mystical, shadow-filled laboratories of Prague and travel south, following the winding silver ribbon of the Danube River. The air warms slightly, becoming soft and fragrant with the scent of blooming lindens, roasted coffee, and the sweet, buttery smell of pastry shops. We are entering Vienna in the middle of the 19th century, a city of grand white palaces, sprawling gardens, and a court that moved with the precision of a music box. Here we find an emperor who was perhaps the most unusual red flag of all. This is the story of Ferdinand the First, a man the people called the Benign. Imagine a man who lived his entire life in a world of velvet and lace, but whose heart remained as simple and clear as a mountain stream. Ferdinand was not built for the sharp edges of the 19th century. He was born with a body that was fragile and a mind that moved at its own slower pace. To the politicians and the generals, this was a red flag of weakness. But to the listener tonight, nestled in the safety of your own space, let us look at Ferdinand's world as a lesson in the beauty of the slow life. As you settle deeper into your rest, imagine the rhythm of the Hofburg Palace. Swish, swish, swish. The sound of the servants' soft shoes on the polished marble floors. The distant, muffled clip-clop of a carriage moving through the courtyard. Ferdinand did not care for the maps of war or the complex chess games of diplomacy. He found his joy in the small, tangible things. He loved the way a botanical drawing captured the delicate veins of a leaf. He loved the feel of a smooth wooden box. And most of all, he loved his apricot dumplings. There is a famous story told of Ferdinand, a legend that captures the essence of his madness. One day, his court physician told him he could not have his favorite apricot dumplings because they were out of season. The emperor, a man who rarely raised his voice, looked at his doctor with a quiet, unshakable resolve and said, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." Think for a moment about that request. In a world of revolutions and empires, Ferdinand's greatest demand was for a piece of fruit wrapped in dough. There is a profound, childlike peace in that. He was a man who had stripped away the red flags of ego and ambition until only the simplest desires remained. He did not want to conquer the world. He wanted to taste the sweetness of the harvest. As you lie there, let your own desires become just as simple. You do not need to solve the problems of tomorrow. You do not need to be productive or efficient. Your only task is to be like Ferdinand in his garden, to simply exist. Imagine yourself sitting on a sun-drenched bench in the gardens of Schönbrunn. The air is still. A single bee hums a low golden note as it moves from flower to flower. Hum, hum, the sun is a warm weight on your hands. You are safe. You are cared for. You are an emperor of your own quiet moment. The red flag of Ferdinand was his innocence. In a world of iron-fisted rulers like Metternich and the rising tide of nationalism, Ferdinand's mind remained untainted by the cynicism of power. He was known to spend hours watching the clouds move across the Viennese sky, finding patterns in the white vapor that no general could ever see. He would sign documents because he was told to, but his mind was already back in the palace conservatory, checking on the health of his rare orchids. There is a rhythm to a life lived without ambition. It is the rhythm of the seasons. It is the rhythm of a heart that does not race. Ferdinand lived through one of the most chaotic periods of European history, yet he remained a pool of perfectly still water when the revolutions of 1848 finally reached the palace gates, and his advisors told him the people were rioting. He famously asked, "But are they allowed to do that?" He was eventually asked to step down, to give his crown to his nephew, and he did so with a grace that baffled the world. He retreated to a palace in Prague, the same city where Rudolf II had once chased the stars and lived out his days in a quiet, rhythmic peace. He spent his time gardening, playing the piano, and, of course, eating his dumplings. He lived to be a very old man, far outlasting the many strong men who had once looked down on him. This is the hidden wisdom of the simple emperor. Sometimes, the greatest red flag is actually a green one, sign that the soul is choosing peace over power. Ferdinand was a man who knew how to let go. He knew that the crown was just a hat, and the throne was just a chair. He chose the garden. He chose the music. He chose the stillness. As we leave the gardens of Vienna, we hear the sound of a distant piano, simple waltz by Strauss, rising and falling like a gentle breath. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The notes are fading now, drifting away into the twilight. We move away from the gentle emperor and turn our gaze toward the setting sun, toward the end of our journey through the royal mind. We travel now toward the final echoes of the old world, toward the jagged, beautiful, and broken line of the Spanish Habsburgs, where the red flags were written not in dumplings or stars, but in the very bone and blood of a dynasty that had forgotten how to breathe. We move now from the sunny, pastry-scented gardens of Vienna and travel back to the west, back to the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. The air here has grown thick again. It is no longer the dry, rosemary-scented air of Joanna's time, but an air that feels heavy with the scent of old incense, melting beeswax, and the damp, metallic smell of armor that has sat too long in the dark. We are entering the Alcazar of Madrid in the late 17th century. This is a world of shadows, of black velvet, and of a silence so absolute it feels like a physical weight. Here, we meet the final chapter of a story, centuries in the making. This is the story of Charles II, the Bewitched. Imagine a palace that has forgotten how to laugh. The Spanish court of the 1600s was a place of frozen time. The walls were lined with the portraits of ancestors, men with high foreheads and women with pale, unmoving faces, all of them connected by a bloodline that had become a closed circle. To the listener tonight, imagine your room is like this Pelusa place where the outside world has been completely shut out. There are no clocks here, only the slow, rhythmic dripping of a water clock in the corner. Drip, pause, drip, pause. Charles was born into the center of this silence. From his first breath, he was a red flag of a different kind, not a mind that had broken, but a body and soul that had been burdened by the weight of too much history. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that had ruled half the world, but in doing so, had forgotten that life requires newness. His blood was old. His bones were tired before he ever learned to walk. To the court, he was a sacred object. To himself, he was a man made of shadows. As you settle into the stillness, listen to the atmosphere of the Alcazar. Hush, hush, hush. The sound of a silk dress brushing against a stone floor. The way the wind rattles the heavy iron latches on the windows. Charles spent his days in a world of ritual. He was dressed by 10 men, he was fed by 5, he was watched by 100. He was a king who could not chew his own food because his jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, was so heavy and pronounced that it seemed to belong to a statue rather than a man. Consider the peculiar peace of such a life. When you cannot move quickly, the world slows down to meet you. Charles lived in a state of perpetual slow-motion observation. He would sit for hours in a high-backed chair of ebony and silver, watching the dust motes dance in the single beam of light that cut through the heavy velvet curtains. To him, the red flag was the world's expectation. They wanted him to be a conqueror, like his great-grandfather. They wanted him to be a saint, like his mother. But Charles only wanted to be still. He was called the Bewitched because the people of his time could not understand his fragility. They thought he was under a spell, a curse of dark magic. They brought him relics and charms. They whispered prayers over his bed while he slept. But the only spell Charles was under was the spell of his own lineage. He was a personification of the end of an era. He was the sunset of 1,000 years of royalty. As you lie there now, feel the heaviness of history leaving your own body. You do not have to carry the names of ancestors. You do not have to uphold the glory of a crown. You can let your jaw relax. You can let your breath become as shallow and effortless as a summer breeze. Unlike the King of Spain, your stillness is not a burden. It is a choice. It is a sanctuary. In the final years of his life, Charles did something strange and poetic. He began to visit the tombs of his ancestors in the Escorial, the great gray stone monastery in the mountains. Imagine the descent into the royal crypt. It is cold there, a cold that feels like the heart of a mountain. Step, 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 the sound of the king's cane echoing against the marble. He ordered the tombs to be opened. He looked upon the faces of the kings who had come before him, Charles V, Philip II, men of iron and fire, and in that cold, dark place he found a strange comfort. He saw that even the most powerful men in the history of the world eventually found their way to the silence. He saw that the red flags of power, the wars, the gold, and the madness, all ended in the same rhythmic, eternal rest. He was not afraid. He was ready to join the silence. The story of Charles II is the story of a candle burning down to the very last drop of wax. There is no flicker of panic, only a slow, steady dimming. When he finally passed away in the year 1700, the bells of Madrid did not ring with the sharp clang of alarm. They tolled with a deep, resonating thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very chest of the city. Brum, brum, brum. The line had ended. The circle was closed. The Habsburg sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a soft, purple twilight. As we leave the cold stone of the Escorial, we hear the sound of the mountain wind. It is a long, steady sigh that carries away the dust of the old world. We move now toward the final chapter of our journey. We move away from the kings of blood and bone, and toward the lessons they left behind in the stars, the trees, and the silence. We move toward the conclusion of our story, where the red flags are lowered at last, and the kingdom of sleep takes its rightful throne. We leave the heavy, velvet-draped halls of the Spanish court and travel far to the north. We cross the churning, slate-gray waters of the Baltic Sea, where the waves crest in silent, white foam. The air here is sharp. It tastes of salt, pine needles, and the oncoming winter. We are entering Sweden in the 16th century, a land of granite islands, dark forests, and a sun that stays low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Here, in the castle of Kalmar, we find a king whose mind was as brilliant and as fractured as an ice floe. This is the story of Eric XIV. Imagine a man who was the very definition of a Renaissance prince. Eric was highly educated, a master of languages, a student of the stars, and a musician who could make a lute weep. But beneath the polished surface of his royal education, there was a red flag that flickered like a candle in a drafty hallway. It was a deep, unyielding suspicion, a paranoia, that the world was not a stage, but a cage. As you settle into the coolness of your sheets, imagine the rhythm of a Swedish winter night. Crackle, pop, crackle, the sound of a fire in a great stone hearth. Outside, the wind whispers through the spruce trees she a sound that never truly stops. Eric lived in this sound. He was a man who believed that everyone, his brothers, his advisors, even the stars themselves, was conspiring to pull the ground from beneath his feet. To Eric, the red flag was the color of blood on snow. He began to see patterns where there were none. He became obsessed with astrology, spending his nights in the high towers of his castle, tracing the movements of Mars and Saturn. He believed the planets were mocking him, whispering of a fair-haired man who would one day take his throne. He looked at his own brothers, and in their blonde hair, he saw the prophecy coming to life. Consider the mental exhaustion of living in a world of codes. For Eric, A whisper in the hallway wasn't just a whisper. It was a death sentence. A glance from a guard wasn't just a glance. It was a signal for an uprising. He began to carry a small notebook, scribbling down the names of anyone who looked at him for too long. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of his quill was the only thing that could drown out the voices of his fear. In the year 1567, the ice in Eric's mind finally broke. During a dark episode known as the Stour murders, the king lost the ability to tell the difference between his friends and his ghosts. He fled into the forest, disappearing for days. Imagine the king of Sweden dressed in rags, wandering through the deep, green silence of the woods. He believed he was no longer a king, but a beast of the forest. He listened to the rhythmic drumming of the woodpeckers tap-tap, tap-tapped, believed it was the sound of the earth's heart. As you lie there now, let the forest of your own mind become a place of peace, not fear. Unlike Eric, you do not have to interpret the sounds of the night. The creak of your house is just wood settling. The wind outside is just the world breathing. You are not a king in hiding. You are a soul at rest. You can let the notebook of your worries fall from your hands. You do not need to keep track of the names or the tasks. You can simply be a part of the stillness. Eric was eventually captured and brought back to his palace, but he was never truly the same. He was deposed by his brothers. The very men he had feared on spent the rest of his life in a series of beautiful, lonely prisons. He was moved from castle to castle, always within sight of the cold, gray sea. He found a strange solace in his captivity. He spent his time playing the lute, the music rising and falling like the tides of the Baltic. Pluck ring, pluck ring. He translated the works of ancient historians. He wrote long, poetic letters to the wife he loved, a commoner named Corinne, who was the only person who could calm the storm in his head. In the quiet of his cell, the red flags finally lowered. The stars were no longer enemies. They were just lights in the sky. The wind was no longer a whisper of betrayal. It was just a song. The end of Eric's story is a quiet one, muffled by the heavy snow of 1577. It is said he died after eating a bowl of pea, super simple, humble meal for a man who had once dreamed of cosmic empires. Whether the soup was poisoned by his brothers, or whether his heart simply decided it had beaten enough times, we do not know. What we know is that the king finally found the one thing he had been searching for through all the towers and the forests. He found the silence. As we leave the frozen shores of Sweden, we hear the sound of the ice cracking on the lakes, a deep, resonant boom that echoes through the trees. It is the sound of the earth stretching in its sleep. We move now away from the north, traveling back toward the center, toward the final lessons of our journey. We move toward a broader view, away from the individuals and toward the legacy of the red flag royalty. We look at the way these fractured minds shaped the map of our world, and how their stories, like the stars Eric watched, continue to shine with a soft, distant light, guiding us toward our own quiet horizons. We travel back across the frozen Baltic, moving through the mists of the Gulf of Finland, until the golden spire of the Peter and Paul fortress rises like a needle from the ice. We are returning to the land of the Tsars, but we are entering a different time era, where the red flags were no longer the frantic outbursts of a single man, but a heavy, inherited melancholy that sat upon the Romanov throne like a shroud of lead. This is the story of the Winter Palace, a building with 1,500 rooms, each one filled with the cold, rhythmic ticking of history. Imagine the Winter Palace in the heart of January. The Neva River is frozen solid, a road of blue ice that leads to the edge of the world. Outside, the wind howls, carrying the white silence of the tundra. But inside, the air is still and heavy. It smells of floor wax, old silk, and the faint, ozonic scent of the coming snow. To be a Romanov was to live in a world of impossible scale. You were not just a person. You were the autocrat of all the Russias. You were the sun around which a sixth of the Earth's surface orbited. As you settled deeper into your rest, listen to the rhythm of this imperial world. Step, 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 the sound of the sentries pacing the long marble corridors. Their boots make a rhythmic, hollow sound, a heartbeat for a building that never sleeps. The Romanovs were a dynasty of red flags written in the language of isolation. They built palaces that were cities unto themselves, where a czar could walk for miles without ever seeing the face of a common man. Consider the life of Alexander I, the blessed czar who defeated Napoleon but found himself defeated by his own mind. He was a man of double-down mysticism. He would sit in his study, the walls lined with maps of an empire he no longer wished to rule, and he would listen to the silence. To him, the red flag was the feeling that he was a ghost inhabiting a living body. He became obsessed with the idea of disappearing. He would gaze out the window at the falling snowdrift, fall, drift, fall, and wonder if he could simply walk out into the white and never come back. Think for a moment about the peace of the great disappearance. For the listener at home, let your day be like Alexander's empire, something vast and complicated that you are now choosing to leave behind. You are stepping out of the palace of your responsibilities. You are walking into the quiet, soft white of your own sleep. You do not need to be the autocrat of your life tonight. You do not need to rule, to decide, or to defend. You can let the snow of the night cover your tracks. You can be silent. You can be still. The Romanovs were also a family of clocks. They loved the mechanical precision of timepieces, perhaps because their own lives felt so unpredictable. In the Winter Palace, there were thousands of clocks. Imagine the sound of them all ticking at once. Tick-tick, tick-tick, a shimmering curtain of sound that filled the air. They had the peacock clock, a marvelous machine of gold and silver, where a bird would spread its feathers and a rooster would crow as the hours passed. But even the most beautiful clock eventually winds down. The red flag for the later Romanovs, like Nicholas II, was a strange, quiet fatalism. He was a man who felt the storm coming, but instead of fighting it, he retreated into the rhythm of his family life. He would spend hours in the gardens of Tsarskoye Selo, cutting wood, rowing on the lake, and playing with his children. He found his sanctuary in the mundane. Chop, thud, chop, thud. The sound of his axe against the birchwood was a way to drown out the pound of the world falling apart outside the palace gates. This is the 12th red flag, the retreat into the small when the large becomes too much. Nicholas was a man who preferred the smell of pine needles to the smell of gunpowder. He was a king who wanted to be a country gentleman. He lived in a state of gentle denial, a rhythmic peace that he maintained even as the shadows grew long and the winter of his dynasty finally arrived. As you lie there, feel the gentle denial of the night. The news, the politics, the noise of the centuriate is all outside the gates. Inside, there is only the warmth of your room and the steady, rhythmic flow of your breath. Like the Tsar in his garden, you are focusing only on the small, comforting movements of the present, the rising of your chest, the softness of the fabric against your skin, the way the darkness feels like a heavy, protective coat. The story of the Romanovs ends in the basement of a house in the Urals, far from the gold and marble of St. Petersburg. But even there, in the silence of their final days, they maintained their rhythm. They read books, they whispered stories, and they waited for the end with a dignity that was its own kind of power. They showed us that when the crown is taken away, what remains is the soul land. The soul knows how to find its way home through the dark. As we leave the vast white plains of Russia, we hear the sound of a distant bell. It is not the alarm bell of a revolution, but the slow, deep tolling of a monastery in the woods. Bong, bong, bong. It is a sound that marks the passage of time in a world where time no longer matters. We move now toward the final 3 chapters of our journey. We move away from the specific faces of the kings and queens and toward the patterns they left behind. We move toward the twilight of the monarchs, where the red flags are folded up and put away, and the long, deep night of history begins. We leave the snow-muffled silences of the Russian north and travel back in time, across the centuries, to the sun-drenched heart of the Mediterranean. The air here is warm and dry, smelling of crushed bay leaves, sea salt, and the hot, white dust of marble quarries. We are entering the Rome of the Caesars, not the Rome of the history books, filled with shouting crowds and clashing swords, but the Rome of the high palaces, where the red flags were first planted in the fertile, dangerous soil of absolute power. Imagine a man standing on the edge of a balcony overlooking the Tiber River. This is the world of Caligula and Nero, men who were told, from the moment they drew breath, that they were not merely kings, but gods. To the listener tonight, imagine the pressure of that belief. If the world is a stage, and you are the only one with a script, the edges of reality begin to curl and fade. As you settle into the stillness of your own room, listen to the rhythm of the ancient world. Lapping, lapping, lapping. The sound of the river against the stone embankments. The slow, rhythmic chirping of the cicadas in the olive groves as the sun begins to set. In the halls of the Palatine Hill, the red flags were written in gold and stone. Caligula, the little boot, was a man whose mind was like a runaway chariot. He suffered from a fever that seemed to burn away the common threads of human connection. He would walk his palace at night, talking to the statue of Jupiter, arguing with the gods as if they were his equals. He was a man of double-down excess. If he wanted a bridge, he didn't just build one of wood. He lined up ships across the Bay of Bight and covered them in earth so he could ride his horse across the sea. Consider the mental exhaustion of such a performance. For Caligula, the world was a toy that he was constantly trying to break to see what was inside. He made his horse a consul. He ordered his soldiers to gather seashells as the spoils of the ocean. To the historians, this was madness. To us, tonight, let us see it as a mind trying to find a boundary in a world that had none. Now, imagine the cooling of the marble under your own feet. Like the ancient emperors, you are surrounded by walls that protect you from the chaos of the city. But unlike them, you do not have to be a god. You do not have to bridge the sea or command the tides. You can let the marble fever of your day, the need to be perfect, the need to be powerful, the need to control, simply dissolve. You are not a statue. You are a person, soft and breathing, leaning into the support of your bed. And then there was Nero, the emperor who saw himself as an artist. Imagine the Golden House, a palace so vast it had a rotating dining room and ceilings that showered guests with flower petals and perfumes. Nero's red flag was the belief that his life was a song. He would spend hours practicing the lyre, his fingers moving rhythmically across the strings. Pluck, vibration, silence. Pluck, vibration, silence. He believed that as long as the music was playing, the world could not hurt him. There is a strange, haunting peace in Nero's retreat into art. While Rome burned, it is said he played his music, not because he was cruel, perhaps, but because he was lost in the theater of his own mind. He was a man who had replaced reality with a melody. As you lie there, let your own golden house be this moment of rest. Let the flower petals of your thoughts fall gently away. You are the musician now, but your song has no notes. It is the song of your breath, in and out, in and out. A slow, ancient rhythm that predates the Caesars and will outlast the stones of Rome. The Roman red flags were the first to show us that power is a mirror. If you look into it for too long, you stop seeing the world and start seeing only the distorted reflection of your own desires. Caligula and Nero were the original shadow kings, lost in the glare of their own divinity. As we leave the crumbling marble of the Palatine, we hear the sound of the evening wind moving through the ruins of the Forum. It is a soft, sweeping sound, like a broom moving over a dusty floor. It tells us that even the greatest empires eventually become a place of quiet. The gods have gone to sleep. The statues have closed their eyes. We move now toward the final 2 chapters of our journey. We move away from the heat of the Mediterranean and toward the cooling of the entire world. We look at the final red flag, the moment when a monarch realizes that the crown is not a gift but a loan. We travel now toward the great quiet, where the stories of the mad and the sane finally meet and merge into the same dark, beautiful sea. We leave the ancient, sun-baked ruins of Rome and return to the wider map of Europe, but the air has changed once more. It is no longer the air of a specific kingdom or a single reign. It is the air of autumn, the long, golden afternoon of the old world. We are entering the 19th and early 20th centuries, an age where the red flags were no longer individual secrets, but signs of a world that was outgrowing its own skin. The air smells of damp earth, chilled iron, and the faint, sweet scent of burning leaves. Imagine a grand palace at dusk. The windows are tall and dark, reflecting a sky that is turning from violet to a deep, bruised indigo. Inside, the candles are being lit, but they seem smaller now, their light struggling against the vast, encroaching shadows of the modern age. This is the era of the divine, right, fading into the distance, time when monarchs across the continent began to feel the ground shifting beneath their velvet-covered feet. As you settle into the profound stillness of this moment, listen to the rhythm of the changing world. Rustle, drift, the sound of the last leaves of the year falling onto the gravel paths of the royal gardens. It is a slow, unhurried sound. It is the sound of nature reclaimed. The kings and queens of this age lived in a state of red flag, nostalgia, rhythmic longing for a time when the world was simpler, when the crown was a sun that never set. Consider the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, a man who outlived his era. He was a red flag of pure, mechanical habit. He rose every morning at 4 o'clock, dressed in a simple military uniform, and sat at a plain wooden desk. He was a man who tried to hold back the tide of time through the power of a schedule. Tick, tick, tick. Every hour was accounted for. Every document was signed in the same precise hand. He believed that if he stayed perfectly still, if he maintained the rhythm of the old ways, the world would stop changing. But the rhythm of the world is stronger than the rhythm of a king. For the listener tonight, let the schedule of your own life fall away. You do not need to be the clerk of your own worries. You do not need to wake at 4. You do not need to sign the documents of tomorrow's tasks. Like the leaves in the palace garden, you are allowed to simply fall. You are allowed to let the wind carry you where it will. You are moving from the doing into the being. In this twilight age, the red flags became more subtle. They were the whispers of the last Tsars, the quiet eccentricities of the last sultans, and the lonely walks of the last Kaisers. They were men and women who found themselves caught between two rhythms, the slow, ancient heartbeat of the monarchy and the fast, electric pulse of the new century. They sought refuge in the quiet corners of their palaces, in their stamp collections, their music rooms, and their private chapels. Imagine the sound of a palace being closed for the winter. Clack. The way the furniture is covered in white sheets, turning the grand ballrooms into forests of pale ghosts. This is the peace of the end. There is no more need for the red flags of defense or the red flags of pride. The ceremony is over. The guests have gone home. The stage is dark. As you lie there, feel the white sheets of sleep being draped over your own thoughts. The bright colors of your day, the conversations, the sights, the sounds are being covered one by one. Everything is becoming soft, neutral, and still. The palace of your mind is being prepared for a long, deep rest. The shutters are closed. The wind is outside. You are inside. The decline of the monarchs was not a tragedy, but a transition. It was the moment the world realized that the red flags of the mind are common to all of Ustaking and the commoner alike. We all feel the weight of the crown of our own responsibilities. We all feel the glass-like fragility of our own hearts, and we all eventually find our way to the autumn of the day, where the only thing left to do is let go. The story of the falling leaves is the story of a world finding its balance. The gold leaf may peel from the throne, but the wood beneath is ancient and strong. The lights may dim in the palace, but the stars above are constant and bright. As we leave the quiet, shuttered halls of the old world, we hear the sound of a distant silver bell. It is the lullaby of history, a sound that tells us that the day is finally gone. We move now toward the final chapter, the conclusion of our journey, where we step away from the stories and into the silence itself. We have traveled a long way tonight. We have walked through the glass-walled corridors of France, the night-shrouded plains of Castile, the whispering oak forests of England, and the golden alchemical towers of Prague. We have seen the red flags, the warnings of mines under the weight of gold flicker and fade. And now, as we reach the edge of our story, the map of Europe begins to dissolve. The borders of the kingdoms melt away, and the dates of the treaties turn to dust. We are leaving the world of who and when. We are entering the world of now. Imagine the great palace of history standing on the edge of a vast, dark sea. The tide is coming in, a slow and rhythmic pulse. Hush, wash, hush, wash. Each wave is a century, each ripple a rain. But the water does not come to destroy, it comes to clean. It comes to smooth the sand where the kings once stood. It comes to wash away the weight of the titles and the burdens of the bloodline. As you settle into the final, deepest part of your rest, feel yourself standing on that shore. You are no longer a listener. You are a part of the stillness. The red flags have all been lowered. The banners are folded. The swords are returned to the earth. There is no one left to rule, and no one left to obey. There is only the breath. Listen to the rhythm of the universe that Rudolph II once sought in his telescopes. It is not a complex machine. It is a simple, steady heartbeat. In and out, in and out. The stars above are not prophecies. They are just white diamonds on a bed of black velvet. They do not care about the rise and fall of empires. They are constant. They are quiet. They are home. Think of the King of Glass and realize that your body is now as light and clear as his mind was. But you are not fragile. You are supported. Think of the simple emperor and his apricot dumplings, and let your mind be just as uncomplicated. You are allowed to want nothing more than this moment of quiet. The palace lights are finally going out. One by one, the candles in the windows of the centuries are being extinguished. The Iron Tsar has found his peace in the snow. The Swan King has found his castle in the clouds. The Shadow Queen has let go of her grief. They are all just stories now, and stories are like smoke. They drift, they linger, and then they vanish into the cool night air. As you drift now toward the edge of sleep, imagine a great heavy door of oak and iron slowly closing. It doesn't slam. It moves with a silent, well-oiled grace. Creak, click. The door to the waking world is shut. The door to the history books is locked. On this side of the door, there is only the softness of your pillow. There is only the warmth of your blanket. There is only the deep, rhythmic silence that has been waiting for you since the sun went down. You are the monarch of this quiet kingdom. Your throne is made of rest. Your scepter is made of dreams. And your law is the law of the breath. Hush, wash, hush. The sea is perfectly still now. The stars are perfectly bright. The history of the world is finished for today, and the history of your rest is just beginning. Let the words fade. Let the images dissolve. Let the weight of your body sink through the mattress, through the floor, and into the deep, welcoming heart of the earth. Good night, traveler. The journey is over. The rest is yours.